just a bit about myself. I graduated from Auckland University in New Zealand, and I'm essentially an architectural refugee from New Zealand. At the time that I left, there was some quite major public work happening in Auckland, and I didn't like the process that they were going about procuring their design and the sort of the specific gestures that they were making. So they were doing very good residential architecture, but they weren't doing very good public architecture. So this was very clearly the place to come. Melbourne's got excellent programs of public architecture and influence of architecture through everyday part of life. So it was great. When I got here, I started work at DCM and worked on the Melbourne Museum, which was a good experience, and then went on to Woodmarsh. And from there, I went to New York and lived there for 8 years, working on a variety of apartment tower buildings, which was also a great experience, probably more for New York than the actual practice part of it. I came back and was project architect for the Australian Pavilion in Shanghai for the World Expo with Woodmarsh, and then set up my own practice. So that was only in 2011. So what you're about to see is just a very short section of work that I've managed to get done in 4 years. These are the projects I'm going to present tonight. I sort of believe in that South Pacific tradition where when you're talking, you pick up a pile of sticks, and that pile of sticks represents how many points you're going to make. You sort of put them down as you go so that you know how long you're going to talk for. So you've got 7 sort of sections to get through, and then we're done. There's a Venus Bay house, which is sort of towards Wilson's Prom, Trentham, like a country house, an addition in St Kilda, one in Carlton, an addition in Fairfield, a new house in Fairfield, and then I just want to have a discussion about this concept of co-opted space, which I've been thinking about. Can everyone see all right? Is that good, as good as we can do? All right, so I thought, when I was preparing for this talk, I was wondering about how to arrange the projects or what order to present them rather than purely chronological. And then I started thinking about how really at the start of the project, we think so much about the context of that project, and that informs the design process right from the beginning, and it becomes the design. Now that context is so variable. It can be the climate, the landform, how the family is going to use it. There's, as I got there, sometimes really crap context, and that you have to decide how you're going to respond to that crap context. And of course, there's no one context. There's a lot of sort of overlapping concerns and contexts that you have to deal with. But I've grouped them in sort of a predominant concern for each of the projects. The first sort of group I would do is the working within a climate context. So both of these projects, like I say, have got many concerns, but the primary one was the climate in which they're located. The Venus Bay batch is in a very sort of, it's on the coast towards Wilson's Prom. It's very buffeted by the wind, but it also requires, it's a weekend place, so you want to be comfortable within that climate so that you get the maximum benefit from being down there. Trentham Longhouse is up in Trentham. Now, it's quite elevated. I think it's 1,000 metres above sea level or something. So it's quite high, quite noticeably higher than where we are now, and it almost has its own microclimate, which is cold. So it can get snow on the ground there. It's got these longer winters than what we see in here in Melbourne, and how we respond to that climate was most important for that project. That is the site as I found it, was presented to me down in Venus Bay. It's an area that I know well. I go down there quite a bit myself and surf around there. It's predominantly scrubby sort of tea tree land. There's a wildfire overlay on there. This was quite a steep block with a northeast orientation. It was a funny site that tapered up to the end of the street, and before we started work, there was you just couldn't figure out where the house should go or what form it would take. There was no obvious solution to it. but it's one that sort of really fell out through the design process. At the beginning of each project that I do, we do what I call a pre-design phase. So before we get into the design proper, I do like an illustrated brief for the clients. So we sort of talk through the briefing concerns that they have, which are fairly standard briefing concerns, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, but also conceptually what they're hoping to get out of the project. But we sort of do a return brief as well. So we sort of talk to the client about what we hope to get out of it and what we think the potential within the project without getting into the design. So for each of the projects I present tonight, I'm presenting our images that we accompany our pre-design phase with. Some of them are used, some of them are not used. Some of them are so clearly there in the end product, it's like you knew where you were going at the beginning. I like to sort of say that the book that we present at the end of it is like a roadmap for where we're going. Like, we don't know what the destination is, but this is the path we're going to travel to get there. And it's a really useful document to do. So for this one, we were looking at ideas of sort of temporary accommodation or sort of lightweight accommodation, because it's just a holiday house, it's not a second home. We were looking at that idea of the form of the building within a landscape, especially given the topography of the landscape, and how that sort of clustering effect on a hill. I must say the clustering thing didn't really end up there, but some of these other images did. So this is the site here. Like I say, very odd shape, narrows up towards the cul-de-sac at the end of the road. A low point down here, and then sort of two high points here. So it sort of falls in two directions down to there. A height difference of about 5 metres from here down to the bottom. The orientation was the key thing for the development of the plan, and that predominant winds down there are from the southwest. So north is here, southwesterly winds are coming in through here. If you can get out of those southwesterly winds, which are probably about 75% of the time, you're very comfortable down there. So we just sort of located the sort of the butt of the building into the southwest. So sort of hunker the back of it to the southwest and shelter it from the wind, open up to the northeast. The other advantage of that is from a solar orientation point of view, your northeast is your ideal orientation, right? So you've got your northerly aspect, but you've also got early morning sun preference, and then by the time it's getting past noon, you're starting to shade yourself. So from a solar orientation, it was ideal, and then from the wind, it was also a perfect match. The other thing about this house, and probably it's my favourite thing about it, is it's a real Pandora's box in a way. It's 4-bedroom house in under 100 square metres. So it's very finely worked out plan, very minimal sized bedrooms, but again, it's just that idea of you need somewhere to stay for the weekend, come and get some bunks, put your bag on the floor, and then it's easy to pack up and go. So the house is about 100 square metres, the outdoor deck is about 20 square metres. So a large part of the plan is actually this covered outdoor deck. The other way we sort of conceived of that deck space was not as indoor-outdoor flow. You know, you sort of hear this term of indoor-outdoor flow, we've got the big sliding doors and we open to the outside. We really tried not to do that, because with a small plan, we're actually trying to create lots of different smaller spaces underneath that larger ceiling. So we've created almost like a screen between them with lots of series of double doors, and that creates a very separate space in that covered deck area. This is a really successful house for having 18, 20 people around, 4 different groups doing things, kids everywhere, some people having quiet time, all within this very small package. And to sort of enhance that separation of space, it steps down as the land steps down. So from the street, from the cul-de-sac, that's all you see of it. You basically don't see anything. It's locked up with big gates. There's sort of a recessed entry where you can hose the dog down and chuck your wetsuit, and then you get into the house proper. So that's down into the front entry. And then that's from the south, the other side. So we're looking at sort of from the northwest direction. We just stepped the decks down and the levels to the maximum height legally allowed without a balustrade. So it is quite dangerous for small kids, but apparently the Building Code of Australia says not dangerous enough to be concerned, so I was okay about that. And it also just removes any obstruction of balustrades from your view. That's from the main face. And then from the side, it's got just this, it's a really simple construction. It's one of those jobs that had a very limited budget. It's maximum volume, minimal sort of detail to it. The cladding is a silvertop ash cladding. It's in a wildfire overlay area, so it's one of the 5 species that protects itself and weathers into the environment. So inside, we've got a dining area stepping down to a living area, then out to the deck. So as I say, quite a simple house inside, but incredibly efficient both in plan and in weekend use and be able to clean it and get out of there, and also for heating and cooling. So you just spend a lot of time down on that deck, you're always out of the wind. And it has a window in it, it feels like a room, it's got a very tall ceiling to it. And that's part of the way we got the bedrooms so efficiently, is we did these built-in bunk beds, and they sort of reference that back facade of the house in its design. The next house is the one in Trentham. It's had an interesting context. That was the context that I was presented with. It was a new subdivision, and we were one of the first to build. So there's no existing built context to respond to. You don't even know where other houses are going to go. Okay, so you've got a reasonably large site. You've got a fairly extreme climate. So we were just going to site the building where it seemed logical, but completely make the most out of a northern orientation, which is at the top here, while at the same time capturing views to the trees to the south. So it was kind of a play of maximum glazed area to the north, but not great views, limited glazing to the south, where you've got great tree views. The clients were getting their son to build it, and he was coming down from Melbourne every day. They were very keen to minimise the complication in the build. So we had to design it in such a way that was easy to build and reasonably quick to build. I sort of seized on the idea of the barn form, both because of its location, its rural location, sort of referencing buildings in that countryside rather than what might be built there in the future. And also just for that ability to have sort of a repetitious form, which would be quite easy to construct because it had a lot of repetition to it. And then we could also group parts of the house together under a single roof. So we had the main house where the retired couple lived, then there's the guest area, then there's a carport, then there was a garage. And so one of my first moves was to say, let's just put that under one long roof. So this is the house here. You drive in to the carport here. That's the northern orientation. There's some pretty ugly houses all around it now, and there's the trees. So from here, we've got the main bedroom, an ensuite and wardrobe, a study, a kitchen area, a fireplace, 2 bedrooms, carport, and a workshop down here. That's the northern elevation, so it's got a spotted gum cladding, which weathers and greys off over time. And the north-facing glass is about 2.7 metres high and has these large sliding screens on it. So in winter, a lot of heat gain onto the slate flooring, and in summer you can sort of close it off and restrict the amount of heat gain you get through there. In the early morning and late afternoon, the eaves designed for midday sun to be completely blocked. There's those large screens. So with that simplicity, a lot of it was about the texture of the materials that you're using. So with the stacked stone wall, the battened screens, and the cladding. And also that thing with the screens is that they cast a shadow onto the floor, especially in winter, which changes minute by minute as it sweeps across. Very simple build for this, a plywood kitchen, slate flooring, and predominantly plasterboard. Again, just for that ease of construction. And you see here, so that's the north-facing glazing. So we're getting really good heat gain onto that slate. And there's a slow combustion fireplace, which they say they need about a log a night on it. And actually most of their heating does come from the heat coming off the slate, which is on a concrete slab, which does actually heat up during the day in winter. So you just that effect of the light you get. The next two projects I want to talk about, it's an adaptive context. And by this I mean the families, both these families have lived in these houses for a while and love these houses, but they also really love the location and what it offers them in terms of being close to the city and transport and the neighbourhoods that they are existing in there. But as their families are growing, they need to change their house to adapt to their current lifestyles. So it was about, neither of them had the space or the inclination to add a whole lot onto their houses, but they did want to change their houses so that it was better suited to the way they were now living. The first one, St Kilda Triangle. So this is in one of the best streets in St Kilda. It's a really lovely street called Lock Street, and that would have to be about the ugliest house on the street. So it was that classic case of worst house on the best street. They bought it, I think they got a pretty good price for it, probably because it's a pretty ugly house. But they were just concerned about their long-term comfort levels in that house in terms of how they fitted in within the context of the street, as well as some fairly poor connections that they had to the backyard. So it had a part of a hip roof that came down to about 2.1 metres above the deck. So you had quite a nice space inside the living areas, but then it just chopped you off as you came to the outdoor area with no proper connection. These were sort of precedent images that we presented them with. A couple of different parts of this. There's this idea of the landscape and how we were going to counteract. They wanted to put a studio and garage out the back, and we were talking about how we could counteract that loss of garden space that they were going to get and bringing that up onto a vertical plane. The other is a sense of an outdoor living area, which could extend their living space to the outside, and how to extend that into the sort of shoulder seasons. And then the other sort of main driving thing was how you fit into this street context of Federation, arts and crafts, and deco houses that were found on the street. Like, what could we do with their house, apart from knock it down, to make it fit in with what was there? This is the plan. I've included the plan. We really didn't add much to it apart from a garage and studio here. It was very much just remodelling what was there. The first stage of the project was just dealing with what it looked like. So I sort of call it this glorified wallpaper, what we did. We just rendered the existing brick and clad the existing roof framing with these dark stained battens. So visually we turned it into this very tall, skinny, I'll just go back a minute. Had a very tall, slender proportion on the street with this very weak sort of folded roof plane. So we just used all that timber framing that's there, that subframe, and clad it with the battens and brought it as a sort of a heavy timber, a heavy gable roof form. And Frank Lloyd Wright's Oak Park House was the sort of the design reference for it. So that helped bringing the volume down on it. And it really did change the appreciation that the neighbours had for the house and the street. When we were finishing this phase of the work, one of the neighbours came up to me and she said, "I love what you've done here. You've increased the value of all of our houses on the street," which I thought was pretty high praise. Then once we got inside, we did a very much a sort of front to back scheme for the clients. So the front rooms, we said, they were the more the quieter formal rooms, I guess, if you like, and that they would be the darker spaces in the house. And we would have quite a high level of contrast between the rooms at the front of the house and those to the back that faced onto the garden. So these were the front rooms, living area, facing out to the street. And again, quite private areas because they do face onto the street, so not much connection there. A study that we put in. And then to the rear yard. So we sort of had a bit of fun with that two-storey structure out the back. It makes barn-like references for the structure. What's going to happen here is that these large triangular screens are going to be completely overgrown with about 3 or 4 different creepers that we've got coming up through there. So that will sort of extend that garden view up onto the vertical face, but also provide heat gain protection from the western sun as it hits that facade. So it will sort of provide a barrier there. It also was, from the start, we were looking at that gable end treatment, and that was our sort of way in to fit in with the street. And that gable end treatment became a triangular motif that we kept working through the design. So as we went from the front to the back, if we ever had design issues or things that we were trying to work out how to solve, the answer was always a triangle. Out the back, we lifted that roof up, again, replicated a gable-like form, but then slipped the roof over the side here to create this outdoor living area. So it does this thing where, on a true elevation, it appears like quite a regular gable end, but in fact, it's a reasonably complex roof form. So inside, we provided a bit of extra space for a dining room. It was a kitchen, a dining area, and a living area. It's now a kitchen, a dining area, and a living area. It's just that it's more light-filled, it's more usable, and they can see themselves here on a longer term. So we added a skylight over the dining table. We pushed this wall out to the laneway. And we actually retained a hell of a lot of the existing fabric. That was actually the roof line previously. So that's a double skin brick wall that we retained. We lifted our roof up and then just infilled it with some glazing. So again, you get quite a lot of complexity through there with the battening and the glazing and the triangular shapes. This house here, go over reasonably quickly because I haven't got it photographed yet. It's in construction at the moment. It's really hard to photograph because it's so tight. That's the house there. So it's a little single fronted terrace. The owners looked to relocate for a while and then they just realised that they loved where they were and that's where they wanted to stay. That's the rear yard. This project was, they had a garage out the back. It was reinstating the garage, putting a bedroom over it, and then can we please get a corridor between the new house and that bedroom? So that was my brief, right? It was just, we need to get a corridor and we need somewhere for a desk, so we're working it after hours. So I jokingly refer to this as our corridor project. We then introduced this idea that within the corridor, the sort of Victorian idea of a corridor and circulation, it becomes like a parlour, places that you could actually pause in or have other uses. Often if you go into, say, even a villa house, their corridors are about 1.5 metres wide, which a lot of corridors have been, say, 900 or a metre. There's an extra 600 millimetres of space that people now put a piano or bookshelves, and it becomes a use through there. So we proposed that for 2 reasons, that we could get use through that corridor, but we could also break up that journey into almost like a sequence of little mini rooms. Brick became a very important material for here. The client had a love of brick, and it was also quite contextual to the existing laneway developments that occur in this area. So this is the existing house. This is the street, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, bathroom, living and dining and kitchen, and then the garage. And then this is our proposed plan. So that remains the same, and then this is this corridor. So we just had a little display space. There's a set of stairs which have got very long treads to them, and it's quite compressive with an outdoor fireplace. Then there's a little play area, so like a 450mm high bench that you can their kids can get the Lego out and play there with some sun. Then there's a desk for working at home, and then the stairs. Second section. So we have to play with scale in this. I mean, it's a small job, but it shouldn't necessarily look like it's just a small job. So we would do things like this. This barbecue enclosure is much higher, almost sculptural in what it's doing, which means that in a small scale job, you want somewhere for your eye to go to because you don't have a great view. So you want your eye to go to somewhere close by and in the mid-distance. And then that gives you a greater sense of the space that you have around you. We also combined these, it's the window to the upstairs area, and then we've used black reflective glass going into the garage space. So instead it reads like this enormous void space or a much larger black glass window. Again, because glass during the day is black, right? So there's that whole misapprehension about what glass is. Glass is not see-through, glass is black. And again, this is just sort of basic render we did of that space, that study space through there and the steps. Building in a built-in seat, which again just saves a bit of space. The kitchen, which we're working on. So that's it from the laneway. And this is a construction shot. So you can get, that's about as good a photo as I can get, standing right back against the wall and given a shot. You can see the scale of it. You see this guy here, he looks like a giant here because of the way those windows and openings are mannered. So they're sort of overscaled. So without him as a point of reference, it actually feels like a larger space. And you're starting to get an idea. All that glazing is north facing. So again, it's got some eave to it, it's got some overhang, but during the winter, sun's going to be coming in, hitting this wall. Corridor is then open to the main bedroom and the rest of the house, and that'll actually pull hot air through there at night. And there's the chimney element. And just the material, like just always great with a small job like that. And the client's been really fantastic about just indulging us in the material in every decision that we make. So right down to the brick coursing there, you see we've done what's called a staggered bond, but instead of staggering it on the horizontal, we've staggered it on the vertical. So it's just all those things you can manipulate. The next two jobs are now working within a suburban context. And I think it's really important to actually highlight this context because I personally don't think we see enough good examples of residential architecture coming out of a truly suburban context, okay? Those two previous projects were in Carlton and St Kilda, and while they're great suburbs, they're not really a suburban context. They're really inner suburbs. They're very urban contexts. These houses, two houses are out in Fairfield. They are much more in that suburban context of a single family house on a 600 square metre block, which is great. You know, like a lot of people want that when they've got growing families and they want to be able to use that space well. They're also being fiercely protected at the moment because people don't like to see them being subdivided with 4 or 5 units. So I'm not sure if you're aware, there's the Res Code, residential zones have recently been amended to protect that kind of development. The problem is that development's actually really good, right? So we should be doing that kind of multi-res, medium density development where it's appropriate. So the amendments have unfortunately sort of given a blanket restriction on those type of developments. So there's a balance that needs to occur because they are great suburbs. The first one, this Fairfield house, it was like a pretty bad 70s house that had a really bad 80s extension done to it. They are pretty much the same story for every house in the street. I guess what I'm saying, this is in a lot of ways that crap context. You know, there was nothing to really work with beyond it's great to be in the suburbs, to have that space, to have a backyard, and to not be too far out. So there's nothing that I felt I really needed to work with in that existing built context. But so then it became about, okay, what's the departure point? What do we design to? And what I wanted to design to was, the client was very concerned about maintaining their backyard, which is fair enough, and then they had their brief concerns. What I started to think about was, how can we provide the built spaces and give them a character or a sense that is beyond the norm in the suburban context, okay? All of these places have got additions out the back. They draw on the plan the space that you need. You do like a 2.4 metre ceiling if you go into a design build company, or you're going to 2.6 if you're getting slightly better. There's no differentiation, or not a whole lot of differentiation in space and in orientation. So I started to discuss with them this concept of void and height and the different character of space. I mean, it's something like that out of Laos realm plan kind of idea. But then I also discussed about it in like pitching a tent. Like a tent is the maximum volume for the least amount of envelope. And that's what we were trying to do. Again, very much a budget circumstance. But how could we create space, generous space, kind of very luxurious space in a way, for a tent budget? The basic answer for that is, you'd basically do the two-story box on the back. So, which is what we did, but we added these voids and views through and openings, and we've slightly kicked it out here to the north, so we're getting better orientation here, providing big overhangs to the west for that late afternoon sun, and then provided a variety of spaces in what's actually quite tight plan spaces. So here we've got a living room, you've got a view outside, you've got a high window here which is screened from sun, then you've got openings through into the dining area. Upstairs you've got a study area with a bridge across, and again these views down into the living areas. So you get to play this game with views and light, family relations, like how you yell to each other or don't yell, and where you can hide away. This is an as-built shot, so I haven't had this properly photographed yet, but there's a few photos here that give you a sense of what it's like. So it's beautifully lit space. You never need to turn a light on during the day. The acoustics are amazing. They do love it. And there's just the plywood ceiling, so a fairly cost-effective way just to add a bit of warmth in that horizontal plane. All the lighting is from uplighting, so you don't have what we've got here is light hitting the top of your head and a glare source from your light fixtures. So the lights are located on the walls and bounce off the warm plywood ceiling. And just when you get artificial light from one room bleeding into the other, windows leaking light, there's a very peculiar sense of the feeling of light in there. The next house, and this is the last project I'm going to talk about, is the Fairfield Hacienda house. It's not far from that one we just talked about, and this was the site context that I was presented with there. It was an old bungalow that was pretty decrepit, and the clients bought it at auction and then had that removed. It was beyond any repair. And then they'd gone to a design build company and they hadn't been very satisfied with that. Come to me and said, what can we do? The context of this particular site, in addition to it being suburban, is that the street is to the north. Okay, so that ideal orientation where your backyard is to the north, and you've got your living spaces onto your backyard and you're facing north, was not what was here. It was like the back to front house. So right from the beginning, the discussions were how do we orientate those living spaces and where we want to be to the sun, but also to the street. Like, how does that work? This is my precedent page that I did for them. So again, there's this idea of material. There's a Marcel Breuer house, the Fisher House, with a courtyard that I was very intrigued by, with these large openings in it. And it had a continuous material from inside to outside. I was also looking quite a bit at some early Paul Rudolph houses in Florida. That was my suburban reference. He was building those new suburbs in Florida, and he was doing it for very cost-effective methods of concrete block and light timber frame construction. So here's the site, here's the street, the house. House is in two parts, bedrooms to the back, living spaces to the front, and then an enclosed courtyard to the street. So the enclosed courtyard holds the street wall. So the street wall is the setbacks of the houses from the front boundary. So it conforms to that. It looks the same as the other houses on the street, but it provides this outdoor space as a buffer between the house itself and the more public side of the street. So again, just flip it here. This is north here, an enclosed courtyard, a living area, kitchen and dining. Carport to the side, with sort of the family entrance around here. Kids' bedrooms to the side with their own living area, and the parents to here, and a central courtyard. This house is, in plan, it's like, when Frank Lloyd Wright used to talk about his budget houses, they were always a 4-square house. So you do a square plan and they have basically 4 rooms, and that's how you build effectively. When he did expensive houses, they became central living spaces with wings to either side. Okay, that was his sort of 2 plan types. In a way, this kind of combines the two of them. If you imagine that this is a central living space and there's a kids' wing here and a bedroom, main wing here, they wrap around that central courtyard. So that's the view in. There's a concrete block predominantly for the walls up to 2.4 metres high, and that concrete block goes from the outside of the courtyard to the interior walls. The importance of that is that that courtyard space needed to feel like a roofless room. It couldn't just feel like you brought your front fence in a bit. It had to feel more permanent and feel like it was more part of the house. So by closing the concrete block walls and then continuing that inside, it reinforced that impression. So this is what I'm saying. From the street, these clients were very concerned about living in the street for a long time. Their brief to me was that it was not to be 2-storey because people didn't like 2-storey in the street. It had to be single-storey. We comply to that setback. We reference those hip and gable roof forms that are found in the area, but we create that interface between the street. And then this becomes this fabulous space that gets lots of natural light. You know what it's like when you go past a brick wall in like late summer evening and you can sort of feel the heat radiating onto the side of your face. You know, that's what you get here. You sort of sit there, you can sit with your back against it, you feel the warmth. It becomes a space that contains a lot of activities. You can sort of have dinner out there, you can go out there and have a cup of coffee and read the paper, the kids can play there. The other thing that it does is that that sort of al fresco dining area now happens at the front of the house. The backyard is just for kicking the footy round, right? So there's no sort of trying to blur those two things together. The family entry is through the carport, so it's a little confusing house in that it has no proper front door. You come in through the gate into the courtyard, and then you're sort of faced onto those living areas. The family day to day go through the carport, and then they dump their stuff here, and they're in the main space. So that's the main living area. They're living behind kitchen and dining. The roof from the outside has those gable and hip forms. Inside, where it pitches and rises, relates to the plan below. So it forms a sort of a low point here at the kitchen and then shoots up over the living and then again provides sort of a peak over that dining area. So even though it's a sort of open living space, the areas are defined by the roof, by the ceiling. The ceiling is a cedar timber. It's a beautiful warm material that'll stay that colour because it's not getting any sun. And the floor is just a burnished concrete floor. Pretty basic house. That's the living area. So it's just that sort of Paul Rudolph reference where the walls go up to 2.4 high and there's clear story glazing in between there and the ceiling. The dining area. This is the study, and that's that central courtyard. So this is going down into the study and then into the parents' bedroom. They're getting light and air through that central courtyard, through shug windows that they can open. They can also see through their kids, and the kids can see through there. That's the sort of passive security that occurs. But as the kids get older, the idea is that the vegetation grows up through that courtyard, and then they can't see each other, which probably suits both of them very well. That's down the other side. That's to the kids' area. And then out the back, like I say, it's where you kick the footy around. It's also a very different construction type. It's lightweight frame construction. It's timber frame, prefabricated trusses, and shadow cladding. So by keeping quite basic mass builder techniques at the back, we were then able to put more attention at the front. And then at night, again, across the top of the window there, there's a strip LED light and blinds concealed within a little pelmet. So all the lighting is reflected off the cedar ceiling. So there's not one downlight in that ceiling at all. So it's only warm reflected light, which is dimmable, that washes down from that ceiling. It's the best way to light. So this won't be too much longer, I promise. That's the projects that I wanted to present. I just wanted to share with you a few things that I've been thinking about in relation specifically to the Fairfield Hacienda project, the Carlton project, and some other commercial ones we've been doing, about this concept of co-opted space. Just to start with, that, I probably can't see it too well there, but that's the plan that my clients for the Fairfield house had prepared by a design build company. So they'd gone through the process of a design build company. You take your property to them, they will do a design, they'll guarantee a price, and then they build it for you. And it's ridiculously cheap, right? So they can do houses, I don't know how they can do it. I do know how, it's like 2.4 metre ceilings, it's basic techniques, and they just do what they do, okay? This is the plan they came. Again, this is north. There's your very nice double north-facing garage. There's your very nice north-facing main bedroom, okay? That's how they respond. That's what they do. That's their standard response. It's not making any sense of that orientation at all, except maybe a little bit of a courtyard in here, and then we squeeze the plan out. And so the orientation was bad. Size was very large. So again, a very large house for the money that they were, because they had default bedroom sizes and living areas which were larger than you need to be, which is why the Australian house is one of the largest houses in the world at the moment, like grossly oversized. As you can imagine, you have to treat this delicately. When somebody comes to you and they say, we can get this 300 square metre house for $550,000, but we'd like you to do a better job. It was quite a process to say, okay, to start with, we're going to face you to the street so all your neighbours can see you. And the second thing we're going to do is reduce the area by a third. So it took a while to talk about that, but they were very open to it, very good about understanding why we were doing those things. This is the design build plan. I've identified here those shaded areas, area that we took out of their plan to arrive at this plan. Then, sort of thinking about it, what was happening here is that the front of the house, that main bedroom, what was looking onto, and the driveway, was kind of a public interface between the street and the house. Public don't necessarily go there, but it's a visual connection, and that's the relationship that they have with the house. The backyard is in yellow. That's private, that's just for the occupants, and the blue is the house itself. What we did here is we've really created sort of semi-public space in that covered courtyard, in that open courtyard. It was always an intention of like I explained, that the clients were very concerned about staying in the neighbourhood for a long time and becoming part of that neighbourhood. We thought it might be if they sort of lived a bit in the neighbourhood, that you could sort of make a connection to it. And that was kind of, I guess, a grand gesture, but one that's been incredibly successful. So they are in here, they know all their neighbours, people come in. We advise that they put their veggie garden in the front and put a bit of citrus on the fence so that they can come along and they sort of producing out the front. It also means that people come by and help themselves to mandarins, but that's totally fine. They have this relationship that you can sort of be within that space and say hello to people or not say hello to people. It's incredibly, even though you feel like you're quite enclosed, it's actually mostly open because it's predominantly voids. But it does give you a sense of security when you're in there, or an ability to close yourself away. But you're also able to literally have a conversation with people on the street. I experienced it firsthand when we went and got the photos done. I had the house for a weekend, and I met a handful of neighbours there and had a good chat, and everybody knew what was going on. It worked incredibly well. So I started thinking about what that space was, and I sort of came up with this idea that it's co-opted space. And then the definition of a co-opt is to adopt for one's use or to take over or appropriate. So what was happening here is that the Fairfield Hacienda was almost giving over part of its house to the neighbourhood. It was kind of creating this blurred zone where it wasn't necessarily the houses and it wasn't necessarily the neighbourhoods or the streets, but there was sort of a sharing that was going on. It was kind of a generosity that occurred. So there's sort of two instances where I see this happening. One is where a space is intentionally given over to others, which is I think what happened at Fairfield. And another is when space is intentionally taken over by others. A great example of where it's taken over by others is in the community gardens that I was aware of in the East Village in New York when I was living there. So during the 80s, a lot of tenements that were in very bad repair were demolished by their owners for insurance purposes and left as vacant lots. They literally were just breeding rats, and homeless people would live there. In a lot of streets, the street would get together and take over that lot and build a garden in there, and they would all look after it and use it. And this continues to this day. What's happened now is they've taken over that space, they created it for the neighbourhood, but now, they wouldn't have foreseen this, but now they've actually been protected. So all those gardens are actually now going to be permanently gardens. So why that sort of proactive approach to that space? They've now actually secured it forever as open space. Another sort of more commercial example that made me was related to this idea of co-opted space was the bodegas in New York. So they shop to the streets. They literally blur that definition of where the shop starts and where the sidewalk is. So you see here, they've got all their sort of fruit and veggies out there and the pavement's right there. Down the side, they even put, there recently, this is sort of a new thing, but they put their glass door refrigerators opening directly onto the sidewalk. Like, it's great. So you just, they're sort of giving it over to the sidewalk, and there's a trust thing that occurs there, because of course you can open the fridge and run off, but they're not concerned about it. Another overseas example is in Japan. You see a lot of this in sort of Asian cultures, is that putting stuff out on the street and the sidewalk, and plants and furniture and seats, and it's a really fantastic thing where it adds a lot of small grain character to the street. and also that sense of ownership to the street, which is actually a great thing to have. And looking at more local examples, this is where there's no co-opted space at all, right? So this is a new subdivision out in Pakenham. So in these kind of residential developments or suburbs, we're not seeing anything that I can point to as being co-opted space. And this is something that I would, that I've been thinking about and think that we need to start applying or working out how we can adopt those concepts into this particular context, which is very difficult. So this is just a couple of photos of how that is working to the street. This is some photos as the garden's been a bit more developed. So that's the Fairfield Hacienda. The house starts right at the curb, or the street goes back to that rear wall. I'm not, I don't know. Another local example where I know it does it pretty successfully is the Hella Street townhouses by 6 Degrees. This was a old refuse site that council let out for redevelopment. 6 Degrees developed it with a developer where they developed the back third of it and then turned the front 2/3 of it over to a public park. So the townhouses front onto that public park with no clear definition of where that private area is and where the public park is. The other thing they've done, they've turned over a public park for the surrounding area. That's the view from the houses out to the park. And another one that you're probably familiar with is the Commons by Breed Architecture, where they've gone to additional lengths in a multi-res example to provide outdoor space up on the rooftop by providing a common laundry, which is very unusual, so you're getting people up there and using that space. They have co-opted the roof space to garden areas, so everyone's got like a co-op sort of garden bed situation, and also some communal living spaces. So they've made an additional effort to give over space or allow the residents to appropriate space, which is usually just metal roofing and if you're lucky, some PV panels. That's pretty well known. The thing that I really like about this project is how it starts to co-opt the street outside. So for a number of reasons, they didn't provide any car parking at this development. So there's no crossover here. So it's just a shop front. So you can start to use the sidewalk without worry of cars crossing over or anything like that. It's at a dead end. They're starting to put their bike block areas out there. This development is just creeping over Florence Street. And if Jeremy has his way, it's going to go creep all the way up Florence Street as well. It's going to be great. And then this is around the side of that development. They've just got some bike parks. They've engaged graffiti artists to come in and line those walls. So it's just continuing that blurring or co-opting of the public space around the building with the bicycle path and the railway line that goes up the side. That's it.